My name is Devakran Rao. I was born on May 4th, 1985, in Hyderabad, India. On August 12th, 2024, I died, or at least I thought I did. I had spent nearly 20 years as an aircraft maintenance engineer. I knew planes like others knew their own homes. I could diagnose issues from the faintest sound, the slightest imbalance in fuel lines, even the smallest rivet out of place. Aviation wasn't just a career, it was my identity. I was a man of systems, of logic, of engineering discipline. Faith? That was for people who had nothing better to rely on. Or so I thought. That day started like any other. We were servicing a domestic Airbus, A320 scheduled to leave for Chennai in 2 hours. I was doing a final sweep when something fell off. Something I couldn't quite explain. Not a mechanical fault. It was more like a pressure in the air, a subtle heaviness. I dismissed it, blaming lack of sleep. I'd been doing double shift for a week. Minutes later, it happened. There was a sudden explosion. A small one, but enough. Fire, smoke, screams. And then darkness. At first, I felt weightless. I didn't realize it. But I was looking at myself from above, my body motionless on the hangar floor. Flames licking the tail end of the plane behind me. People running. My colleagues shouting my name. Devakran. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. I wasn't there anymore. I was hovering above, watching everything with a strange calm, as if my soul had been separated from the chaos below. Then a pull, a sensation like being drawn upward, not just in height but in vibration, like my essence was rising into something greater. The earthly sounds of emergency, sirens yelling, engines faded, and a soft stillness took over. My vision blurred into light, not blinding but warm, surrounding me in a brightness that wasn't made of light at all, but presence. I arrived in a space that felt endless and alive. I stood, though I had no body, on something like a path made of translucent light, stretching into a horizon I couldn't see. All around me were tones, harmonies that I didn't just hear, I felt. They vibrated through my essence, like truths without words. That's when I saw him. He didn't need introduction. He didn't speak his name. But I knew, more deeply than I'd known anything in my earthly life, that this was Jesus, the one I'd ignored, the one I'd dismissed as a crutch for weak people. He looked nothing like the images I had grown up seeing. No long white robe, no crown of thorns. He was radiant, yes, but it wasn't the radiance of appearance. It was authority, love, truth, all at once. He looked at me, not as an engineer, not as a failure or success, but as a soul, a created being. His eyes pierced every layer of my life, and yet I felt no shame, only exposure, followed by healing. Then he spoke, not with words, but with thought that carried more power than thunder. Devakran, you've been faithful in your craft, but blind in your spirit. What you are about to see is not for judgment, but for awakening. In that moment behind him, a vast panoramic vision opened up. I saw the hangar where I died, but it began to ripple and shift. The imagery changed into symbols I could barely grasp, mechanical parts morphing into spiritual constructs, as if the physical realm I had so long worked in was only the surface of something far deeper. And then I saw the crash, not just mine, but others, future crashes, in India, in other places. But they weren't just malfunctions or bad weather. They were warnings. Why? I asked, not aloud, but in my heart. And he answered, because the world trusts in systems and not in me. Because pride now steers the controls, not wisdom. Because men serve machines, but not the maker. It was like every word peeled away a layer of blindness. The deeper he spoke, the more I saw, not just aircraft, but the hearts of those who built and flew them. Ambition, greed, neglect, fear, and among it all, a rising darkness, subtle yet strategic. Then he turned toward me and said, "You will return. You must tell them, not to create panic, but to awaken preparation, not just in checklists and inspections, but in their hearts." I couldn't speak. I didn't want to leave, but his gaze sent me spiraling backward, falling through layers of light, through silence, through memory, until I slammed back into my body with the force of 1,000 waves. A gasp, pain, light, the hospital room, beeping monitors, voices shouting in Hindi and English. I was alive, but I was not the same. The moment I found myself in that place, where sound was swallowed by serenity and time folded in on itself, I understood something deep. I was no longer in control. The monitors in that sterile Manhattan penthouse clinic had gone flat. My body was lifeless. And yet, I hovered above it, a spectator in my own death. What struck me first wasn't fear, but clarity. I saw my own face, gray still, and utterly disconnected from the empire I'd spent my life building. For the first time in decades, I wasn't surrounded by lawyers, advisors, or opulence. I was suspended in a dimension where none of it mattered. Then the light came. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a dream. It was real, fiercely, beautifully real. It shimmered like liquid purity, warm and impossible to look away from. The light had formed, and within it stepped a figure I instinctively knew was Jesus. Not because I was told, but because my soul recognized him the way a child recognizes their mother's voice. His eyes held eternity. His presence was so penetrating that every layer of pride, denial, and self-justification I'd ever constructed melted in a moment. I stood there completely known, and yet somehow still fully loved. He didn't start with accusations. There was no gavel, no courtroom, just this overwhelming compassion that made me want to fall to my knees, not out of guilt, but because I realized I had lived a lie. He showed me, not through words alone, but through visions as vivid as any day I'd ever lived. The first was my daughter's 10th birthday. I saw her sitting alone in a balloon-filled kitchen, waiting for a father who never came. I'd been finalizing a hostile takeover that morning. I had told myself, this is for her future. Jesus let me feel what she felt that day, abandonment cloaked in party hats and silent tears. Then came more scenes, dozens. My son's football game. My wife crying on the balcony after another lonely anniversary. The mother I'd placed in a luxury nursing home, but never once visited. Employees I'd ruined with downsizing decisions made to please shareholders. homeless shelters funded through my foundation, used as tax write-offs, never once visited by me. Jesus said, "You are not condemned by your wealth, Jonathan, but by your worship of it. You became what you served." It struck me like thunder. All my life, I had sworn I was just being smart, strategic, efficient. But in that place, stripped of all illusions, I saw the truth. I had been a slave to gold, wrapped in the robes of a king. I had measured my worth in profit margins and portfolio growth, never in kindness, mercy, or love. Then, as if reading the ache of my heart, Jesus spoke again. This is not the end. It's the revelation before the return. I wanted to weep. I wanted to shout, to kneel, to hide. But mostly, I wanted another chance. A chance to make it right. He nodded, not at my words, but at the silent cry of my soul. And then came the final vision, one I didn't expect. He showed me a world in desperate need. I saw young people drowning in depression, marriages collapsing under the weight of secrets, communities starving for attention and hope, and all the while, vaults filled with unused money sat gathering dust under marble floors, mine among them. "You can return," he said, "but not as you were." I knew what he meant. I couldn't bring the light with me unless I let go of the darkness. And so I said yes, not with my mouth, but with every trembling fiber of what remained of me. Then, just as suddenly, I was back. A choking gasp, lights flashing, nurses yelling, my chest burning with defibrillator jolts. The doctor stared at me in stunned disbelief. "He's back," someone shouted. I was alive, but not the same. The visions continued, like chapters unfolding in a book I never knew I had written. Jesus didn't need to speak aloud for me to understand. His presence carried meaning deeper than any human language. He showed me moments of my life where I could have chosen love, but instead chose power. Where I could have forgiven, but instead enforced contracts. Where I could have been a father, a friend, a man of compassion, but instead became a fortress of ambition. I saw my son, Caleb, his 6th birthday, the light on his face as he looked toward the door, waiting. I had promised I'd come home early. I didn't. A boardroom presentation ran long. My assistant reminded me at the start of the day, but I pushed it aside. "Tell him I'll make it up to him," I had said, and I never did. That moment etched itself into his heart, and Jesus let me feel the weight of my absence, not with shame, but with revelation. I hadn't just missed a birthday. I had taught my son that success outranked love. Then came my daughter's high school graduation. Her speech mentioned my wife, her teachers, even her younger brother, but not me. I watched myself sitting in the back, absorbed in my phone, scanning stock alerts even as she called out into the crowd for people who shaped her. I wasn't among them. I had invested in every emerging market except the one under my roof. The next scene crushed me. My wife, Sophia. She sat alone at the kitchen table, tears running silently down her face as she read an article about me in Forbes. Visionary of the Year, it said. There was a picture of me smiling in a $1,000 suit, shaking hands with investors, the very same week she had begged me to join her at counseling. I told her I didn't have time. I couldn't bear to see more. "Please," I whispered, breaking the silence. though Jesus hadn't yet spoken aloud. I didn't mean to lose them. He looked at me, eyes filled with both sorrow and mercy. You didn't lose them, Jonathan. You traded them. That sentence pierced through everything. I had made trade after trade. Time for money, presence for prestige, love for leverage. I thought I was building an empire, but what I really built was a monument to self-deception. But Jesus didn't end the vision there. Suddenly, the scenes changed. I saw myself standing in front of a small crowd, not investors or shareholders, but children. Children in tattered clothing, barefoot, with wide eyes of hunger and hope. I was giving, not for tax breaks, not for reputation, but out of love. In another vision, I was embracing Sophia, older now, with streaks of gray in her hair. We were laughing, not at gala or cruise, but in a modest living room surrounded by our grandchildren. And then I saw myself praying. Me, Jonathan Vale, on my knees beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a stranger, a man with no wealth, no accolades, only a dying breath. And I was there for him, not to close a deal, but to sit in silence with him as he crossed over into the same realm I now stood in. Jesus turned to me then and said, I gave you the strength to build, but you use it to build for yourself. I gave you time, but you use it to serve your image. I gave you people, but you only saw them as obstacles or tools. Jonathan, your heart was not evil, but it was misled. And now I am giving you a choice. My spirit trembled. A choice. He nodded gently. You may remain here, and all your questions will be answered, or you may return and become the man I created you to be before you let money write your story. I wanted to stay. There was peace here that made every earthly joy feel like a flickering candle beside the sun. But I also wanted redemption. I wanted to find Sophia, to apologize to Caleb, to walk with my daughter, to show the world that love is more than a word whispered in church. It's a force more powerful than gold. I said yes. And Jesus smiled, not just with his mouth, but with his whole being. Light poured from his face, and warmth filled me from the inside out. Then he touched my chest with his hand. The next thing I knew, I was gasping for breath. My ribs felt like they'd been hit by a truck, but my heart thundered back to life. I was surrounded by paramedics shouting, defibrillators sparking, machines beeping. But I didn't care. I had been dead for 23 minutes, and now I had been reborn, not just in body, in spirit. The days following my return from death were a strange mixture of public chaos and private rebirth. News had leaked that I had died and somehow come back, just long enough for reporters to swarm, speculating about my miraculous survival. But they didn't know the truth. No one did, not even my closest staff. I barely understood it myself. What I knew, however, was this: I had to act. I had to obey what Jesus showed me. The urgency wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual, visceral, eternal. I had looked into my own soul and seen the disease. Now I needed to do the surgery. No anesthetic, just raw obedience. The first call I made wasn't my CFO or my legal team. It was to my son, Elijah. He answered on the first ring. His voice trembled. Dad. Elijah, I said, my own voice cracking. I'm sorry. I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there. But I saw everything. I saw what I missed. Please, I don't want to waste another day. Silence. Then, okay, let's talk. It was a small moment, but for me, it felt like heaven cracking open. Over the next few weeks, I began the process of liquidating vast portions of my empire. Private jets, art collections, entire real estate portfolios, gone. I gave quietly at first. Hospitals, orphanages, rehab centers, anonymous donations, no PR, but word spread. At first, my board thought I had gone mad. Jonathan, this is irrational. One of them said in an emergency Zoom meeting, you're tanking your net worth by the minute. You're wrong, I said gently. I'm reclaiming it. I could tell they didn't understand. That was fine. They hadn't died. They hadn't stood before Jesus. They hadn't felt that holy silence wrap around them like a judgment and a bomb at once. Every night I prayed, not out of guilt, but out of hunger. I wanted to stay close to that light, to that presence. I read scripture for the first time in decades. The word seemed to pulse with meaning. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? It wasn't metaphor. It was biography. Mine. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a youth center I had anonymously funded. I hesitated. Public speaking wasn't my strength unless it involved venture capital. But something stirred in me. Jesus' voice, echoing in memory, set others free. I stood before them, a sea of teenagers and young adults from broken homes, many of whom had never seen a dime of wealth in their lives. And I told them everything. My rise, my fall, my death, my encounter with Jesus. They didn't blink. They listened, rapt. One girl began to cry. A boy in the back stood up and said, "You're the first rich man I've ever trusted." And I realized this was my purpose, not to hoard wealth, but to redistribute wisdom, not to secure power, but to testify to grace. I met with Elijah again, in person. We hugged for the first time in years. I wept into his shoulder. I told him how I had missed the day he scored his first touchdown, how I skipped his high school graduation for a stockholder meeting. He didn't speak much, but his arms around me said what I had longed to hear. I forgive you. With every step of surrender, I felt lighter. My heart, once a fortress of control, had become a house of prayer. Jesus had not just saved my soul, he had resurrected my life. When I returned to my penthouse, if you could even call it that anymore, it no longer felt like home. It felt like a cage. Everything was polished to perfection, but I could see now that it all meant nothing. The R on the walls, the Italian marble countertops, the views that once made me feel invincible, they mocked me now. I walked through the rooms with new eyes that saw the loneliness soaked into every fiber of the furniture. I saw echoes of arguments I'd had with my ex-wife about work, about money, about never being around. I remembered the silence that followed. I remembered my daughter's ballet recital I missed for a hedge fund meeting. I remembered the son who stopped calling because I never picked up. And then I remembered what Jesus showed me, that Every one of those decisions came with a spiritual price tag. I didn't waste time. I called a family meeting. They were hesitant. My daughter, Sarah, showed up with eyes full of skepticism. My son, David, kept checking his phone like he didn't expect me to mean what I was saying. My ex-wife, Lydia, crossed her arms, waiting to be disappointed. But I told them everything. The heart attack, the 23 minutes, the light, Jesus, and the truth that I had failed them, not as a provider, but as a father, a husband, a man. I wept as I spoke, not out of shame anymore, but out of longing for redemption, for reconciliation, for a second chance to love them well. It didn't all happen overnight. Trust isn't reborn in a single conversation, but it started that day. Sarah took my hand. David looked up from his phone. Lydia's shoulders softened. It was the beginning of something I'd never had before, authentic connection. I moved out of the penthouse a week later and into a modest home in Queens. I sold my companies one by one, not for maximum profit, but for transfer of stewardship. I didn't want my empire anymore. I wanted to build a kingdom that would last beyond this life. I began giving, not recklessly, but intentionally. I sought out single mothers drowning in medical bills. I funded addiction recovery centers, youth shelters, and churches in struggling neighborhoods. I gave to people I once would have ignored in boardrooms, janitors, cafeteria workers, anyone who reminded me of the value I'd once overlooked. I walked the streets, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had seen the truth and come back to live it out. I kept very little for myself, just enough to cover my new life, which was richer in ways money could never touch. But more than giving away money, I gave away my story. I spoke in churches, at schools, in business seminars. I told them about the peace I met in the light, and the horror of realizing I'd been building my life on sand. I watched grown men cry in their suits, college kids rethink their dreams, mothers squeeze their children tighter. The message was clear: money is an evil, but the love of it can rot your soul from the inside out. One night, I was asked to speak at a gala for a high-profile philanthropist. In the past, I would have judged their net worth before shaking hands. This time, I simply told the truth. I told them about the silence that filled my penthouse, about Jesus' eyes burning with sorrow and mercy, about how treasure in heaven isn't taxed, doesn't depreciate, and doesn't die when you do. I told them that wealth is a test, and I had failed it, until I met the one who gave me a second chance. After I finished, a woman approached me in tears. She said her husband had died chasing wealth and never said goodbye. She said my story was like hearing his apology from beyond the grave. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It never was. Jesus had let me live again not to hoard the truth, but to multiply it. And so I kept going. I traveled. I visited orphanages in India, flood victims in Louisiana, war survivors in Syria. Every time I saw the same thing: eyes hungry for hope, not money. Hope, purpose, a name that could still be redeemed. And I carried it with me every step of the way. The memory of Jesus' eyes, so filled with truth and mercy, never left me. Not in my waking hours, not in my sleep, They became the compass that guided me out of the wasteland I had built and into a life that, for the first time, was truly alive. My return to the world wasn't met with fanfare or a second chance announcement. It was quiet, humbling. My doctors were baffled. "You were gone for 23 minutes," they whispered, disbelief etched into their faces. They had no words for what had happened. But I did. I had more than words. I had a mission. I began with my children. I called each of them, those whose birthdays I'd forgotten, whose tears I'd ignored, whose laughter had echoed in my absence. Some refused to meet me at first. I couldn't blame them. Years of neglect and emotional poverty can't be erased by a single moment of enlightenment. But I kept showing up, not with money, not with grand gestures, with listening, with humility, with apologies soaked in truth. Then came my fortune, my once precious empire. I met with my financial advisors, stunned board members, and confused attorneys. "I'm giving most of it away," I said simply, "not for tax reasons, not for legacy, for freedom." I donated anonymously at first, feeding families, rebuilding storm-broken towns, funding small churches in remote villages. I funded addiction recovery programs and shelters for abused women. I rebuilt lives not for recognition, but because I knew what it felt like to have everything and still be dead inside. The news caught on eventually. Billionaire gives it all away after near-death vision. Headlines painted me as either insane or enlightened. I didn't care. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for the ones whose faces I saw in that realm, the ones Jesus had shown me, the broken-hearted, the forgotten, the abused, those crushed by a world that worships wealth and punishes weakness. One morning, I found myself sitting alone at a park in Brooklyn, watching a young mother lift her daughter onto a swing. Her laughter rang out like a song I hadn't heard in decades. And I cried, not out of sorrow, but because I was finally seeing, finally hearing, finally present. This moment was wealth. No vault, no portfolio, no skyscraper could compare. Jesus had shown me that I had made money my master, that I had traded love for luxury, relationships for returns, people for profit. But he had also shown me that it wasn't too late, that I could be reborn. And I started speaking quietly at recovery meetings, not revealing who I was at first. I told my story to men clawing their way out of greed and addiction. I visited prisons and listened to inmates who had never had a father speak gently to them. I hugged a man who had once tried to rob one of my stores, and I wept as he forgave himself. We were both captives set free. One night, lie beside my now reconciled wife, her breath steady in the dark, I whispered a prayer. "Thank you, Jesus, for stripping me of everything that didn't matter so I could find what does." I don't know how many days I have left, but I know they won't be wasted. I no longer build towers that touch the sky. I plant seeds now, quietly, in soil that matters. And if you're reading this or listening, let me plead with you. Don't wait for your heart to stop before you start living. Don't let your soul go bankrupt in pursuit of treasure that can't follow you beyond the grave. Ask yourself, what owns you? Because I was a billionaire, but I was bankrupt in the only economy that matters. And I had to die to realize that love is the only thing that lasts. Have you made money your master without even realizing it? Has your soul gone quiet under the noise of ambition? I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Let's speak honestly. Let's help each other out of the dark vaults we've built around our hearts. And if this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear what truly matters before it's too late.